Our metaphor enabled us to see where social and communal provisioning was relevant and where individual self-interest was. The foundations of social and cultural norms strongly corresponded with conservatism. We came to appreciate that peoples were well served if their cultures mandated mutual responsibilities and mutual respect. If cultures obliged their members to fulfill their responsibilities for the care of their children and the formative development of their youth, they stood them in good stead for advancement. Indeed, our policy thinking around these foundations found a strong resonance in conservative thought. The support structure of capabilities underpinning the stairs strongly correspond with redistributive thinking. It is about social investment in people's capabilities, health, education, and so on. Social investment is critical. Our policy thinking around these support structures found strong resonance in social democratic thought. But the stairs themselves and their rational alignment and the fact that they were ascended by real individual human beings climbing in pursuit of their own interests strongly corresponded with liberal thinking. We understood the power of choice, rational incentives, and that the ultimate engine of development and progress is the self-interest of individuals on behalf of their families. We came to Adam Smith via our staircase. The most powerful engine at the centre of development is the self-interest of individuals seeking a better life for themselves. We then turned our attention to the policy challenges of welfare reform. Broadly, there were two problems: unconditional welfare and what we came to call the welfare pedestal. It was patent to us that the absence of conditionality on welfare was a serious mistake in the original design of the safety net. The social problems occasioned by unconditional welfare do not become apparent immediately. They grow over time. But when you get to the stage when society is essentially funding dysfunctional lifestyles of individual adults who then neglect their social responsibilities to their children, families, and neighbourhoods, then unconditional welfare makes no sense. Basic social and cultural norms were fractured in our communities. Norms relating to parenting, respect for elders and neighbours, expectations of personal and social responsibility. And the problems grew as welfare dependency became intergenerational. We proposed that welfare be made conditional. And in 2007, federal legislation was introduced to enable us to implement this reform. The Queensland Government then enacted legislation to create a Family Responsibilities Commission as a statutory body empowering local elders to adjudicate these welfare conditions. We are now 3 years into a 4-year trial of these reforms, which have as their aim the restoration of social norms in our communities and the mandating of personal responsibility. If passive welfare did anything, it eroded personal responsibility. We became convinced that even as we worked to get our people into the real economy, there was an urgent need to mandate some basic responsibilities to ensure that the interests of children in particular were upheld. The requirement to attend school being one of the most important. The second aspect of our welfare reform challenge concerns the welfare pedestal. Let me explain. If the price of each rung on the stair increases as you ascend, there's a step at the bottom of the staircase which is out of step with the bottom rung because it is of higher value. To get on the staircase of the real economy, one must step down before one can step up. This is the welfare step, which a grandmother from Cape York dubbed the welfare pedestal. When you compare prices on the welfare pedestal and at the entry level of the real economy, you can see the disincentive effects plainly. In Australia, the pedestal prices have been growing, and the cost of stepping into the real economy have become more marked. Life on the welfare pedestal in a country that distributes money through a generous family tax benefit system is quite a rational choice. We currently have no policy response to the welfare pedestal problem in Australia. The Australian government has not addressed this aspect of our reform agenda. This therefore represents a major gap that still needs a solution. When we began our reform thinking in Cape York 10 years ago, we were in part inspired by the reforms implemented in the United States under President Clinton when Congress enacted the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in 1996. Conditionality in welfare and strong work obligation requirements seem to us to be the obvious lessons from the United States experience. We also look to Prime Minister Tony Blair's less conclusive attempts in the United Kingdom, where they seemed to get the rhetoric right, but there was little concrete reform. In Australia, the new Labor concept of social inclusion attracted the attention of Julia Gillard, and upon the Labor Party gaining government in 2007, she established a social inclusion board pursuant to her obvious embrace of the British concept. After 10 years of looking to North America and Britain for reform inspiration, I've come to the conclusion that there is a country from whom we have more to learn than either of these traditional sources of policy foment in our own region. And that country is Singapore. The problem with Australian policymakers and leaders looking to the United States and Britain for solutions to problems of poverty and development of the large and growing numbers of disadvantaged peoples in these societies is that there is little evidence of success. The per-aura reforms in the United States did succeed in a narrow sense, but it cannot be said that the United States is a paragon of poverty elimination and widespread uplift of the lowest classes. The same thing with Britain. Why are we looking to Britain and the United States for policy solutions when they are so patently struggling with the same problems without making much of a fist of them? Yet when you look at the story of Singapore under the leadership of Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew since 1965, you see a society whose success in achieving broad-based uplift of their people is unparalleled. Yes, it is probably hard to think of a less analogous situation to that of remote and undeveloped Cape York Peninsula than that of the modern city-state of Singapore, peopled by an enterprising population of overseas Chinese, Indians and Malays, exploiting the special blessings of their geography, but I contend that the policy lessons are absolutely germane. Before I identify what I think those lessons to be, let me first set out a brief outline of the Singapore story and the distinct part that they took from that taken by the developed nations. In his fascinating memoirs, Lee Kuan Yew says that he and his fellow leaders aimed to create for their country a fair society, not a welfare society. Lee Kuan Yew recognised from the beginning that the form of welfare provisioning which the advanced Western nations were implementing would produce problems. And they explicitly pursued a different philosophy and a different path. He wrote, "Watching the ever-increasing costs of the welfare state in Britain and Sweden, we decided to avoid this debilitating system. We noted by the 1970s that when governments undertook primary responsibility for the basic duties of the head of a family, the drive in people weakened. Welfare undermined self-reliance. People did not have to work for their family's well-being. The handout became a way of life. The downward spiral was relentless as motivation and productivity went down. People lost the drive to achieve because they paid too much in taxes. They became dependent on the state for their basic needs." The great difference between the Singaporean approach and that of the welfare states of the Western world was, as Lee Kuan Yew writes, "We chose to redistribute wealth by asset enhancement, not by subsidies for consumption." There is, in fact, a great deal of redistribution in Singapore. It is just that redistribution is strictly aimed at asset and wealth development capabilities of its citizens. Central to the entire approach is the compulsory savings system of the country's Central Provident Fund. The leaders of Singapore built around the CPF an array of individual and family solutions for home and apartment ownership, retirement funds, and so on. They mandated family-based solutions to welfare whilst subsidising those things that enhance the earning and asset accumulation capacities of individuals. By mandating a universal approach to compulsory savings and home ownership, Singapore's policies included everyone in the society. The denizens of the shanties were not left to their own devices. They too were supported into apartment ownership.